This is Diane Steepro. I'm representing Jeffersonville Township Public Library, and tonight we're bringing you the program, Revisiting the Founding Era, the Roots of Financial Inequality. And before we start, I have a few announcements about other library programs and events. If you open the chat bar by clicking the conversation bubble at the bottom of your screen, you'll see relevant links in a few minutes when I post them. Next Thursday on May 6th at 6:30 p.m., Jeffersonville Township Public Library, in conjunction with Falls of the Ohio Genealogical Society, will co-sponsor a program featuring me, Diane Steepro, presenting about the complex and troubling life of her fifth great-grandfather, early Indiana legislator, General Washington Johnston, famous for making the speech that persuaded Indiana to outlaw slavery in its first constitution, and also infamous for breaking his own law. He's a pretty rotten guy. The library would also like to encourage everyone to take a look at our two new history tours at Discover Indiana tours. At Freedom's Gate, African Americans settling in Clark County, and Orphans of Clark County, remembering and rediscovering a county's lost children. Moving on to tonight's program. Welcome everyone to Revisiting the Founding Era. I'd like to thank the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the American Library Association, the National Constitution Center, and the National Endowment for the Arts for providing financial support for this program through a Revisiting the Founding Era grant. The grants are intended to explore the relevance of the founding era in contemporary communities. Our speakers tonight include the following amazing people: Kelly Ryan, Executive Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs and second in command at Indiana University Southeast. Kelly oversees academic programming, faculty development, and many student success initiatives. I'm sorry, I should have said Dr. Ryan. Prior to serving as the Executive Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs, she worked in leadership roles in academic programs and was the Dean of the School of Social Sciences. Dr. Ryan is focused on building support systems for students and engaging with the community to enhance the value and vision of higher education. Dr. Ryan is a professor of history and author of two books, Regulating Passion and Everyday Crimes. Regulating Passion is available for checkout at the library here. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Maryland, College Park, her master's in history from Boston College, and her Bachelor of Arts for George Mason University. She has won several teaching awards. We also have with us tonight Dr. Daniel Krebs, who is the 2020-2021 Harold K. Johnson Chair in Military History at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and an associate professor at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. He is the author of A Generous and Merciful Enemy, Life for German Prisoners of War During the American Revolution, which is also available for checkout here. He is a co-editor with Lorian Foote of Useful Captives, the Role of POWs in American Military Conflicts, and his research and teaching focus on military and early American history. Frank X. Walker, professor of English and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, where he founded Pluck, the Journal of Affrilachian Arts and Culture, is the first African American writer to be named Kentucky Poet Laureate. He has published 11 collections of poetry, including Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, which was awarded the NAACP Image Award for Poetry, and the Black Caucus American Library Association Honor Award for Poetry. He is also the author of Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York, winner of the Lillian Smith Book Award, and Isaac Murphy, I Dedicate This Ride, which he adapted for the stage. Voted one of the most creative professors in the South, Walker, a Danville native, coined the term Affrilachian and co-founded the Affrilachian Poets. His most recent collection is Masked Man, Black, Pandemic and Protest Poems, which is also available for checkout here. And I noticed it was just checked in today. So I would like to welcome everybody and turn this over to our moderator, Dr. Ryan.
Well, thank you, Diane, for having us and inviting the three of us to be part of this presentation. It's really just always such a pleasure to work with you and the Jeffersonville Township Library. And of course, every historian of early America is always thrilled to work with Gilder Lehrman, American Library Association, and the National Constitution Center, all of which, of course, advance the importance of historical knowledge to critical thinking, which I know Daniel, Mr. Walker, and I all are big boosters of. So tonight's program, as Diane mentioned, is about financial inequality. And she's going to share in the chat room there the list of documents that you can review about the founding era, just to familiarize yourself with all the important people and who made that great change during the American Revolution. I thought I'd start off tonight by discussing one of the individuals who lived through the American Revolution, but maybe we could hear from him directly, sharing with you the life story of a man by the name of Peter Kitterage, who was born in 1748 or 1749. We're not clear because birth records of African Americans were not well maintained during enslavement. So Peter Kitterage is an African-American man who fought for the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And if you wanted to look at page 29 of those revisiting documents, you could see for yourself his words. But I'll go ahead and advance the screen so you can read along with me if you like. The document starts out with him saying, "I beg leave to state to you my necessitous circumstances, that through your intervention, I may obtain that succor which suffering humanity ever requires. Born of African parents, and as I," whoops, sorry, my screen is. "Born of African parents, and as I apprehend in Boston, from whence while an infant I was removed to Rowley, and from thence again to Andover, to the family of Dr. Thomas Kitterage, with whom, as was then the lot of my unfortunate race, I passed the best part of my life as a slave. In the year of our Lord 1775 or 6, and in the 25th year of my age, I entered into the service of the U.S. as a private soldier, where I continued 5 years, and where I contracted a complaint from which I have suffered in a greater or less degree ever since, and with which I am now afflicted. After leaving the army to become a sailor for 2 years, I tarried as a day laborer. 8 years passed, I removed to the place where I now live, and have until this time, by my labor, assisted by the kindness of the neighboring inhabitants, been enabled to support myself and family. At present, having arrived at the 58th year of my life, and afflicted with severe, and as I apprehend, with incurable diseases, whereby the labor of my hands is wholly cut off, and with it the only means of my support. My family at this time consists of a wife and 4 children, 3 of whom are so young as to be unable to support themselves, and the time of their mother is wholly occupied in taking care of myself and our little ones. Thus, gentlemen, in this my time of extremity, I am induced to call on you for assistance, not in the character of an inhabitant of the town of Medfield, for I have no such claim, but as a stranger accidentally fallen within your borders, one who has not the means of subsistence, and in fact, one who must fail through want of disease, unless sustained by the fostering hand of your care." And he signs off there. Peter Kitterage represents one of many African Americans who served during the Revolutionary War on one or the other side of the conflict. As the letter denotes, he's removed from his parents at a very young age and placed in homes he had no choice in being part of. The needs and desires of masters came first during this time period. Opportunity emerged with the American Revolution for Peter when he entered the military at 25, and he served for 5 years, but he was also injured, a lifelong injury. After that time, he became a sailor and a laborer, but illness, as he mentions, left him disabled, and he was requesting assistance from the town of Medfield to support his wife and 4 children. Early America is not a time of great financial and social equality for African Americans, but nevertheless, great strides were made by African Americans and others. Hierarchy was very resilient, and often new structures of power replaced old ones like that of slavery. I'd like to share with you today the story of some African Americans as they move through the era of emancipation, the first emancipation which occurred in the North, as well as some of the difficulties that women more broadly faced. Starting with African Americans, it's important to keep in mind that there were legal, social, and other methods that purposefully intended to keep them outside of avenues towards power. Indeed, the North embarked on a graduate and immediate emancipation campaign. Massachusetts itself, where Peter resided, ending slavery in 1783. But after that time, they passed laws particularly to circumscribe African Americans' access to social, political, and economic equality. For example, in 1788, 5 short years after emancipation, Massachusetts passed, quote, an act for punishing and suppressing vagabonds, common beggars, and other idle, disorderly, and lewd persons. Make no mistake, this law targeted African Americans, specifically having passages that suggested that African Americans from out of the state could not reside there. A warning out system also existed. This system intended to remove the poor, which included newly freed African Americans from towns. If you recall from the letter I just read, Peter described himself as not actually having a legal claim to Medfield. So what that means is he wasn't recognized as an individual there who deserved access to alms. And so he wrote that letter hoping that his service as a Continental soldier would empower them to provide the support that he needed. Laws like that established in 1788 basically made it very difficult for African Americans to obtain the mobility they needed in the wake of emancipation. African Americans who had lived in established places wanted new lives that didn't always refer to them as the servants or slaves of so-and-so in the community. This law also limited the types of jobs that individuals could have and condemned those who were mobile as vagrants. It pointed out that, quote, stubborn servants and drunkards would be subject to arrest, and it set aside beggars, jugglers, and those who used palms to read fortunes. Those individuals also would not have freedom of mobility. This law obviously circumscribes the ability of Southerners who were enslaved to find their way towards freedom and safe haven in the North. Massachusetts and other northern states weren't actually interested in being safe havens for runaway slaves. And runaway slaves became part of a larger homeless, poor, and migrant population that traveled around the margins of communities in early America. And there was no safe haven, and they looked for short-term work. Ultimately, cities became the best places for newly freed African Americans who self-emancipated or were part of Northern emancipations. Just to give you a sense of what one city looked like, I could share with you, for example, Philadelphia, where financial inequality and the criminality imposed on African Americans was rife. In the 1820s, 25% of aid recipients in Philadelphia's almshouse were African American. And this disparity was even greater in the city's vagrant and debtor prison, Arch Street. During those same years in the 1820s, 48% of the convicted vagrants incarcerated were African American. This law was targeted and aimed at the migrant poor and recently freed African Americans. The next slide I have talks about the lack of generational wealth, but Mr. Frank Walker is going to share a little bit about that. So I'll set that aside for a moment and just share with you some more information about increased enslavement and incarceration. Slavery actually grows and expands in the South and West after the founding era. There's this brief moment of zeal in which individuals saw that dichotomy between the ideals of the American Revolution and enslavement, but it ends all too quickly. And in the North, no new structure is put in place to make sure that the vestiges of slavery disappear. Indeed, incarceration seems to be the first tool of individuals to try and maintain hierarchy. The first prisons are actually built in America in the founding era, and African Americans experience outsized incarceration rates, as the example I just gave you showed. My first book looked at some of the sexual crimes that African Americans were targeted for, but I'll set that aside for now. Another response to emancipation in the North in the founding era was increased segregation. African Americans lived within the homes of whites during enslavement, but immediately after emancipation, cities quickly adopted segregation practices. African Americans respond by building their own churches and educational institutions, but these are difficult to fund among newly emancipated individuals, and yet they do so. The African Methodist Episcopal Church is built, community organizations are built, educational societies are built, often alongside white benevolent organizations, but the relationships between these individuals are fraught with patriarchal and racist values. Finally, I thought I'd share with you one of the strains of research that I did in my last book, which was violence. Segregation and inequality was maintained by violence in the founding era. Public insults, attacks by mobs, attacks on individuals, racial epithets were part of daily life for African Americans in the founding generation. They fought back. They fought back by reporting assaults, and they did so in a justice system that was not responsive as it could have been. I thought I'd share with you one story I wrote about. In New York City, sweeping, chimney sweeper was a segregated occupation. It was an occupation held by African Americans, and whites responded negatively to these African Americans simply performing a vital function for the city. In 1812, William Wilson, an African American chimney sweeper, saw a man mishandle one of his apprentices and told him, quote, not to strike the boy. William Ferris, the white yeoman who stroked the young African-American man, was unwilling to let what he perceived as an insult go. Ferris and a few others picked up stones, threw them at several African-Americans, and cried out, quote, let's kill the damn Negroes, end quote. The African Americans who took this case to the court did so courageously and noted that they had been struck, quote, violent blows against their head by a stone. The effects of this assault could have been deadly, and yet the jury system did not convict the whites who attacked these African Americans. This was obviously an intended assault to keep the streets cleared of African Americans. Whites routinely complained about the sweepers' presence and considered them dirty and loud, even as many citizens expressed the importance of the work they did because they limited fires in a very population-dense city. The attack on these African American men and boys was not isolated. Whites assaulted at least 4 other African American sweep drivers and masters in 1815 and 1816. And the city wasn't the only place, of course. Events in rural areas are ripe as well. One African American man in Hillsdale, New York, died when a mob stoned him to death, and the grand jury did at least indict the men, but they were all acquitted. It took a lot of courage to report these crimes in early America, but African Americans began building their own network of white allies and their own organizations to fight back. And the founding era ultimately became an area of growth that would be central to the abolitionist movement that became so lively in the 1830s. The other thing I wanted to briefly touch on is gendered inequality, because there is some overlap there. Women had social codes that limited their mobility. For example, African American and white women couldn't actually address mixed sex crowds. And race and class very much so limited women's access to mobility as well. A woman who walked about in the nighttime, for example, would be considered a night walker. And this is associated with selling sex. Access to, kind of quote, virtue for women was their access to power. And so limiting women's mobility was incredibly important to maintaining the gendered hierarchy. Women lacked access to equal educational opportunities, as did African Americans. No math, science, often no reading. Ladies' academies did develop in the 1820s, but these are really for middle and upper class white women, not all women. Violence also, of course, structures the life of women, women who, in particular, the poor African-American women, those who are highly mobile, they are also threatened and circumscribed. As with African Americans, there are some legal codes that seek to limit women's economic vitality as well as their legal rights to be a kind of whole person. When a woman married, she was defined as a subject to her husband. He owned the estate. He was the legal representative of the family, and only very elite women had access to what we would call, prenuptial agreement that gave them access to the wealth they brought to the marriage. And finally, I wanted to share with you one of the major turning points in early American history is the understanding of women's labor. In colonial America, women's labor was vital to the colonial experiment. Women were basically, providing a lot of the goods that allowed households to run. And yet, as we move into the founding era, one historian by the name of Jean Boydston identifies that women's work was pastoralized, meaning that women's labor began to lack value and become associated with kind of their goodwill as wives and mothers, and that their work was taken for granted, even though it did have market value. Women's labor in the home actually provided a lot of savings for the family, particularly if you consider the cost of bringing in another person to labor. To give you a sense of what this labor meant to women, I thought I'd share with you a passage from Harriet Beecher Stowe, a letter she wrote to her sister about a year after she moved to Brunswick, Maine. It was the first opportunity that Harriet Beecher Stowe, a famous author in American history, had to write to her sister. And she writes that, quote, she had made 2 sofas or lounges, a barrel chair, diverse bedspreads, pillowcases, pillows, bolsters, mattresses. She'd painted rooms and revarnished furniture. She'd also laid a months-long siege at her landlord's door, lobbying him to install a new sink. Meanwhile, she'd given birth to her 8th child, made her way through the novels of Sir Walter Scott, and tried to meet the obligations of her increasingly active career as an author. All of this while attending to the more mundane work of running a household, dealing with tradespeople, cooking, and taking care of the children. Halfway through the letter, Stowe paused, quote, and yet I'm constantly pursued and haunted by the idea that I don't do anything. It's a jarring note in that letter, a reminder that women's work and the demands of it was nonstop, and yet it held very little value outside of their own homes and often within it. These were major changes in early America, and the vestiges of them, of course, do remain with us today. At this point, I'd like to turn over the conversation to Daniel Krebs, my good colleague at University of Louisville, to share his thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I hope everybody can hear me. Can I get a thumbs up? Perfect. I'm gonna share a quick presentation. Right, I hope everybody can see it. I can see it too. So Kelly essentially outlined what I'm trying to explain. How do we get here? So when we're thinking about these African Americans, and in particular, but in general, all these Revolutionary War soldiers, how did we get to a situation that we have this kind of financial social inequality? When we have, as Kelly also pointed out, this moment where things seem to change, where things seem to be in flux, where we have suddenly also for some African Americans, for Blacks in that revolutionary America, a moment of freedom. So how did we get here? And so one of the key points that I'm going to try to point to explain is how these soldiers were paid. As Kelly said, these Black Americans were on all sides of that Revolutionary War. And let me see, how do I advance? Let's see, that way. There we go. Perfect. That is one too far. Okay. They were on all sides of that American Revolutionary conflict. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Army side rather than the Navy. That's a whole different topic that I don't want to touch tonight. We can chat in the discussion about it. But I'm going to focus on the Continental Army and the militia and how these soldiers were paid, and especially then African Americans. Congress had no real power actually to pay any of those soldiers because Congress did not have the power to collect taxes. So when they were building up their army in 1775, the main problem remained that they had no real way to actually pay the soldiers that they're recruiting into that army. The states were responsible for collecting taxes, but the states focused on pulling together soldiers for their state militias. So the Continental Army and soldiers in the Continental Army were a distinct disadvantage because if there was money available, it went into state militias, much less so to the Continental Army. The solution for Congress was now we know, a time-honored tradition, and that is to print money, literally print money on paper bills, and thus use these paper currencies to pay its soldiers. I have some pictures here of that continental currency that was printed. The problem with that currency was that it was not backed up with, for example, taxation or any other value. And so what we see over the course of the war is that this currency inflated a lot, lost its value, and by the end of the war, it was essentially worthless. The only revenue that this Congress had really of substance had flowing in was coming from its allies, particularly the French. Millions and millions of what was then the main currency at the time, Spanish dollars, were sent into the Americas by the French. But this went not just to pay, but also supplies, uniforms, etc. So for you guys, the takeaway is that these continental soldiers were usually not paid or underpaid because the only currency available was that paper money. As a result, what was tried is essentially paying these soldiers in two different ways, two other ways. Particularly those that stayed or hopefully stayed to the end of the war. And that was, on the one hand, literally bonds, promises that we will pay you at some point. And on the other hand, that was land promises, that if you stay until the end of the war in our military, in our army, then we will give you that kind of tract of land in that particular part of America. So those were the two main ways, other than the paper currency, that these Revolutionary War soldiers were paid. The problem is that these promises, these bonds to be repaid the debt owed by the continents or the state of Virginia or the state of Pennsylvania. And also those land promises, they were not worth much for many of these soldiers that needed cash right now. And so what they often did, they traded these bonds or these land promises. And there were, of course, a lot of speculators, financiers, bankers, wealthy merchants, etc., willing to buy up these bonds, to buy up these land promises. But obviously, they would not pay the full face value or the value of the land that was promised to these soldiers. So we have thousands of soldiers using these bond promises and using these land promises to somehow get a little bit of cash to get by, and thus selling it to land speculators, financiers, merchants, anybody that was willing to pay even a fraction of the actual value. And that is where, in that whole complex system, that a level of class really comes in, because we have on the one hand these soldiers that are trying to somehow get by and are not being paid in real money, but these paper bills or these bond promises or these land promises. And on the other hand, we have those that are wealthy in the now independent United States and are able to buy up these promises on the cheap. And just to give you an idea here, so for example, here you see an image of one of those bonds, where here the state of Connecticut promises to a soldier that at the end of the war, we owe you a certain amount. And if you return that certificate at that point, we will give you that amount of money. Ultimately, that indeed happened. That is the famous, Hamiltonian financial system that was set up, and that many of you might have heard about in the musical. But the problem is that many of those soldiers did not benefit from that, because they had already have to trade these kinds of promises beforehand at a fraction of the actual value. And here are a couple of examples of these land promises. So instead of some states and also the United States, instead of either paying in worthless paper currency or these bond promises, land warrants, land bounty lands were another way, as I explained. And we can identify certain tracts of lands in various states that were essentially designed for, this is where these soldiers get their lands. And they were all out in the West, interestingly. To take Pennsylvania as an example, Pennsylvania has essentially what eastern Pennsylvania today. The person for Pennsylvania were all the Allegheny River. And as a explanation, and just let me point out that this land was not at all yet under control of the state of Pennsylvania, let alone even owned, because it was then only purchased in 1784. It was not surveyed. It was this vague promise that out there in the West you will get land. Pennsylvania was not the only state doing that. The other state, the biggest state at the time doing that was Virginia. Virginia, and this is interesting for you guys in Louisville right now, for these kinds of land promises to soldiers out West. You can see it on this map here. The military reserve in what is today Kentucky, parts of Tennessee, and also parts of northern Kentucky and Ohio. This is where Virginia promised that here, soldiers, this is in the West where you will get your land that is essentially your payment for military service. But again, the problem is that very few of these soldiers could actually go there, settle that land, clear it, start farming it, etc., and instead sold their promises of land, their bounties, often to land speculators way before at a fraction of the actual value. Now I want to talk a little bit then about another payment that was promised to many Revolutionary War soldiers, and that is long after the war, and those were those pensions. Already during the war, we have some promises for pensions for disabled veterans. After the war, it took a number of years that the United States then finally, after 1818 until 1832, started giving pensions to needy Revolutionary War veterans that could prove that they had served. And the letter that Kelly read for today is one of those, where they had to write up and prove their military service and thus receive a pension. So those were the ways in which Revolutionary War soldiers were paid or supposed to be paid. Now let's take a look at how that affected Black soldiers in the American Revolution. And Kelly showed that slide as well. So we have Black Americans serving on all sides of that Revolutionary War. On the Patriot side, or what they call themselves, the Patriots, on the American Revolutionary side, the Loyalists, those American colonists that stayed with their loyalty, stayed with the British Crown, the British Army and Navy, and also British allies and their auxiliaries, among them, the Germans that I studied. All of them had Black soldiers in their ranks. At the start of the war, though, and I'm going to focus on the revolutionaries here because that's, the topic for our conversation. At the start of the war, though, the leader of that Continental Army, George Washington, did not want Black soldiers in the ranks of the Continental Army. Here is a Southerner, and here are many Southerners, and not only Southerners, but also Northerners worried about training and then arming enslaved men because of the fear of a potential slave insurrection. The reality was, though, that almost immediately after the war broke out, whether it was the militia or the Continental Army, everybody struggled to find enough recruits. And so the realities of warfare in that conflict pushed all sides to recruit wherever they could find soldiers, also among enslaved Black and also free Black Americans. To give you an example, one of the very famous paintings that we have on that American War of Independence, here the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware toward the Battle of Trenton and then later on Princeton. And there is a Black man in that boat. There is a Black Continental Army soldiers. There's some speculation whether that was a slave out of Washington's household that is serving for freedom. And that is the key that we have to understand when thinking about Black soldiers during the Revolution. On both sides, they primarily served in order to get their freedom. The promise of freedom for service in the Continental or state militias on the Revolutionary side, or the promise of freedom on the British side, that join the British Army, join us versus the rebels, and we will make you free. We even then, and this is going back to that drawing that you saw with Kelly in my presentation, we also have a whole unit, the first Rhode Island regiment that was made up of African-American, of Black soldiers. And here's something important to keep in mind. That was the only segregated unit in that Continental Force. All other Continental Army and also state militias had Black soldiers, but they were serving alongside their white fellow soldiers. The Rhode Island Regiment was the only segregated unit. This is really the last war, or there's some discussion, but this is really the last war that we find in American history, where we have Black soldiers serving alongside in integrated units with white soldiers all the way until the 20th century. So an important moment here in American and in Black history. Historians estimate that about 10 to 15% of all Continental Army soldiers were actually Black, free and enslaved. Free soldiers often pushed into that service because they felt that their position as free Blacks were threatened. Enslaved Blacks serving on both sides because they wanted freedom. And here's an important number, and I'm not going to bombard you with numbers here tonight, but the key number to keep in mind is that a lot of Americans are very, excited that Black soldiers served in the Revolutionary forces, but when you look at the numbers, a vast majority of Black Americans actually joined the British. What we know as historians is we can think that about 5,000 Black Americans, enslaved and free, joined the revolutionary cause, but about 20,000 Black and free joined the British cause. In other words, those Blacks believed the British promises more so than they believed the revolutionaries' promises. And that's something to keep in mind. To give you an example, that even the Virginia legislature realized that something was going awry, and this is where it's leading and connecting with Kelly's talk. The legislature had actually voted in 1780 to grant every recruit who enlisted for the duration of the war 300 acres of land, and here comes then the kicker, and a choice between a healthy Black male slave between the ages 10 and 30 or 60 pounds in hard money. So while we have on the one hand, there's appeal to Black recruits for the Continental and state militias, we have legislatures that offer white recruits who join a Black slave, or the choice of a Black slave or money. And then in that document, even those slaves that had been promised manumission, freedom in exchange for service in the Revolutionary Army, even the Virginia legislature recognized that something is going wrong because they often did not receive that freedom, were actually re-enslaved. And so the Virginia legislature actually here passed an act directing that those that had been promised freedom would actually have to be freed, or as it says here, to force them to return to a state of servitude contrary to the principles of justice and to their own solemn promise. So here chiding these slave owners that would re-enslave soldiers, that Black soldiers that had served in the Continental and Virginia state militia, instead of giving them what was promised, and that was their freedom. In terms of compensation, all of these Black soldiers who stay on the revolutionary side were actually eligible for all the same monies and all the same promises and all the same lands that their fellow white soldiers were. So there was no limitation on them. But here, and again, this is where Kelly's remarks become so important. Immediately in the aftermath of the war, these Black soldiers were put at a decisive disadvantage, socially, financially, legally, and thus had to very quickly, if they had any of those land bounties, if they had any of those bonds, try to make them into some sort of money, and thus were put at a disadvantage vis-a-vis some of their fellow white soldiers that were able to hold on longer or even negotiate for a better compensation if they wanted to sell their promised bonds or promised lands. That is what I wanted to say in terms of compensation, and I'm going to pass the mic on.
Mr. Walker, you can feel free to take your time and share with us your perspectives.
Sure. Thank you. I've been sitting here trying to think about all the ways everything Daniel and Kelly both said connects with what I could have said or what I want to say. And I'm struck by all the ironies, and particularly how Thomas Jefferson is at the center of so much of this. Before I even get to Lewis and Clark, I think it's worth saying that the hesitation to arm slaves was a real fear, particularly when the thing that dominated the news at the time, I don't think it's been mentioned here yet, was that the Haitian Revolution was in full force. The most successful decade-plus long slavery revolt in the world, which we recognize as the Haitian Revolution, which the French lost gamely, which forced the sale of the Louisiana Purchase, which Jefferson engineered for the United States. So, there's this large acquisition of land that comes out of this historical phenomena that people are afraid to talk about. And the fear of slave resurrections around the country precipitated even more violence against slaves. There's this horrible story about slaves in Louisiana being beheaded behind an attempt at revolution, and their heads being hung on sticks and pikes for other people to witness. So I think it's important that we start in that space, that fear is real and this land is acquired, before I get to Lewis and Clark. Before I leave Jefferson, the idea of people of color being disenfranchised and not having land is an easy idea to sell if you first convince them that African Americans don't deserve it. In Thomas Jefferson's notes to Virginia, he wrote about Phyllis Wheatley, who I have to mention because in Kelly's last slide, there was a picture of Phyllis at the bottom of the slide, and I was like, I have to mention Phyllis. This well-respected, intellect / slave owner has some very strong words to say about Phyllis Wheatley, and they come out of a space that is about insisting that white supremacy is a real thing. He said in the book, in many locations, things that support the idea that white people were intellectually, emotionally, even the way they loved were superior to Black people or African descendants. And one of the reasons he said that Phyllis Wheatley could not be a poet is because she was an African American, and he believed it was impossible for her, in spite of the fact that she had endured the equivalent of a PhD defense by the city's elders, about her work to prove that she'd actually written them. and she had to go to Europe, England to be published. He refused to acknowledge that it was even worthy of criticism, is his quote, I believe. So I had to add that in on top of what I wanted to say, because Thomas Jefferson, and Haiti and Phyllis Wheatley are all intertwined. So imagine, some 20 years, not even 20 years, but in the early 19th century, 1803, Jefferson has acquired all this land, and he wants to send two gentlemen along to see what's there. And what he wants is not just to explore and discover. He wants a route to more riches. It's all about acquisition of money and land and power. So he employs Lewis and Clark as soldiers. And we all grew up with the story of Lewis and Clark, so much so that we all believed there was just two people that made this thing happen, not 42 individuals that made up this expedition, including an African-American manservant who was, he acquired him in his inheritance, who belonged to William Clark. And the thing I want to say about York is that his experience was really unusual for an enslaved person, because York carried a gun and a knife and a hatchet. And the first thought you would have to your head, if you have the means to free yourself or to at least fight against something, why did you not do that? And it was because I could not answer that question. I decided to do a lot of research on York's life, which meant researching Lewis and Clark, to the point where 3 collections of poetry exist, all personal poems and the voices of the participants that tell York's story, that include Jefferson's story, William Clark's point of view, multiple points of view, and they hopefully shine a light on all these historical details, but in a different way, because it's poetry. And what I'm going to do is read a variety of poems in a variety of voices to give you some insight as to how I approach these same topics. This first poem I'm going to read is imagining York explaining his arrangement with Clark and his idea of what this expedition was even about. And this is a poem, touch some light on here. It's a poem called God's House, and it's in the first collection of the trilogy, Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York. And the poem has an epigraph that says, the expedition left the Louisville, Kentucky area near the Falls of the Ohio on October 26, 1803. This is in York's voice. When we first left Kentucky, the trees had commenced to dressing up the fall harvest, and the garden was already full of pumpkins and squash. Master Clark didn't ask me to go on no expedition. He just said, pack, and pointed to the door. So I gather up what little I got and more than I carry his, and head off to a sail-bearing keelboat where his friend, Master Lewis, is waiting. That boat was so big, you could lay any 10 of the 16 men on board, or 8 of me head to toe, and still have enough room for the dog. We start out on the Ohio and swing up the Old Man of Rivers. When we gets to the mouth of that dark woman they calls the Big Muddy, we sets up a winter camp, a good canoe ride from St. Louis. That spring, when the rains come, we cross the Mississippi and commence to climb the Missouri and float right up through heaven on earth. More sky than I ever seen, rocks as pretty as trees, and game so plentiful, they comes right down to the riverbank and invites themselves to dinner. Now, I ain't what you would call a scripture quoter, but the first time I seen the waterfall at Missouri, felt a herd of buffalo stampede and looked down from the top of Rock Mountains, it was like church. And where else but God's house can a body servant, big as me, carry a rifle, hatchet, and a bone-handled knife so sharp it could peel the black off a lump of coal. And the white man still closes his eyes and feels safe at night. So that gives you some context to what I imagine York experienced as a man who did not own himself. The other thing that I'll talk about is York's relationship with his wife and the idea that that marriage wasn't sanctioned by the state, even though it existed. And it speaks to the lack of power that they both had over each other and their bodies. This is a poem called Sundays and Christmas that puts it into context. And the epigraph says, because of York's duties as Clark's traveling full-time body servant and the fact that his wife was owned by another family in Louisville, they lived apart and saw each other infrequently. York is speaking. I cares plenty for my wife, but I've been told a slave can't truly know love, being as massa and white men's in general have and take certain privileges with our women. I suspect the deepest hurt in the world be the risk being tied to a woman's hearth and standing on the front porch while the massa part her thighs, knowing that any cry raised is inviting death or worse. But what else but love make you hold that woman even tighter? Try to rock her back to hold long after the tears dry up and the hurt turns to ashes, back to flames. It'd be a nighttime and deep into winter. I think of no other breath I wish to feel and no other whisper I ache to hear. What we allowed to feel might not rate as love, but it'd be powerful enough to make you rue the time between visits. So one of the things that I was trying to do in this collection is to push back against this notion that Jefferson advanced that African descendants lacked the intellectual ability to create, to be creative, to think in the same way as their white counterparts, and this idea that we couldn't love in the same way, that he and people like him tried to make intimacy between Black people more like what happened between animals, which made it easier to treat us like slaves and to advance this idea of owning property and chattel, not human beings. So that inhumanity that was advanced really supported the idea of continuing enslavement. And not to pick on Jefferson, but it's hard not to. The other large irony is that at the same time, he's producing children with an African-American slave that he owns. And it was decades before historians would even allow them to even think that was true. So I'm gonna skip ahead to the end of that book and just focus on what happened when York got back from the expedition, believing he had earned, having contributed mightily, believing he had earned his freedom as had been promised to him by his owner. And this epigraph is a quote directly from William Clark, a letter to his brother Jonathan in 1808. Clark, he has got such a notion about freedom and his immense services that I do not expect he will be of much service to me again. I gave him a severe trouncing the other day, and he has much mended since. Every communication about the relationship between York and William Clark was always warm and positive. They made it seem like they were best friends, even having grown up together and being pretty close to the same age. And this remained the case until they returned from the expedition. It took these letters to reveal what the nature of that disagreement was about. And York wanted to go back to Louisville where his wife was. And we presume there were children, but there's nothing that verifies that. So he had family in Louisville, but Clark was assigned to this new position in St. Louis. And he basically sent York back to Louisville to say a final goodbye to his wife for good, which is, well, it is what it is. This is York in a poem called Just Rewards towards the end of the book. I rode and walked as much and carried more than any man on the expedition. When we returned, Massa Clark got acres of land, lots of pay, and grand balls in his honor. I got a short week in Kentucky to say goodbye to my wife before returning to his new home in St. Louis. Unable to fill all my emptiness with whiskey, I earned many lashes at his hands for being what he calls insolent and sulky, or what I call speaking up for my freedom. In these letters to his brother, he talks about having to put York in jail and to beat him, to make him into a slave again. And if you can imagine the freedom he experienced those 3 years, having to retreat back to this other state, just because his master had the power to do so, had to be more than difficult. There are a lot of poems in the second collection that speaks to those details. And I'm gonna read about 4 more and say a few things and then pass it on. But the idea of where this poverty comes from, or the lack of land comes from, is something that just keeps coming up. Here's a poem in the second collection called Prenup Agreement. One president's dream, plus 2 captains, almost 3 dozen men, one 15-year-old Indian wife, her baby, a slave, plus 1 55-foot keelboat, 2 pirogues, 176 pounds of gunpowder, 420 pounds of sheet lead for bullets, not enough whiskey, minus gifts of 12 dozen pocket mirrors, 4,600 sewing needles, 10 pounds of sewing thread, 130 plugs of tobacco, for about 15 miles a day for 3 years and over 8,000 miles equals 2 heroes, double pay for all, 320 acres of land for the men, 1,600 acres for the captains, and nothing for York. I mean, the reality of that, I mean, the 1,600 acres or nothing. This is William Clark commenting on York's complaining. In the epigraph, it says, give a slave a bad master and he aspires to be a good master. Give him a good master and he wishes to become his own master. And that was Frederick Douglass. William Clark speaking. I love my servants as much or more than my friend Lewis loved his fine Newfoundland seamen. They have become so much a part of this family. It would grieve me mightily to lose any or have to sell them off. I've had to give the lash to almost all my people since my return, as they have developed a most sour attitude which has begun to affect their work. Any interruption of work or challenging of my authority costs me time and money. I have never cut off a limb or finger, starved near to death, cuffed women in irons, or beat any of my Negroes stupid like other men. I provide for their food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. I treat them like my own children until they are buried in the grave. Others think me cruel for not granting manumission to my boy, York. But what rational businessman would cut a hole in his own purse? So that hopefully gives you some idea of his position. And let me close with one more, I think, if I can find the one I was looking for. This one is in the voice of York's mother-in-law, or stepmother, who is not fond of York, based on research. And there are all these allusions based on how he behaves to York being a wife to William Clark. That's one of the criticisms that comes out of his family's kind of irritation with him. Too many wives and none. The voices rose, York's father's wife. I wish I could feel bad for that boy, York, but I can't. He has some hurt coming. I feel bad for his wife, though. No telling what she gonna have to do to survive down south. Blistering sun and cotton fields ain't no place for a woman. She was a little foolish for choosing him, but a good wife is what she was. Too good for his heavy hands and pig-headed ways. After she gone, maybe he'll appreciate what he had. He did his share of knocking, and now he getting his own on both ends. that fool really only loved the forest. And up till he come back here still a slave, was a pretty good wife to Massa Clark. But don't tell old York I said that. If that boy fell off a cliff, his daddy would say, look at my boy fly, and get mad if you say different. So I'm gonna stop there because that's a little bit of humor, and I have to find a soft place to land because these poems are so difficult because they speak so clearly to the disenfranchisement that African Americans experience. And people talk about the period of enslavement right before the Civil War as if that is the real focus on enslavement, and only when it got difficult, when they were picking cotton. But if you consider what it means to be treated as a human being, what it means to experience and not experience freedom, and understand in the 18th century, there were free men. Many of those individuals who joined the Continental Army and the British side were free men who wanted to fight for other people's freedoms. Those parts of the stories are always kind of glossed over because, I think we've mythologized the entire American Revolution and condensed it to like 5 heroes and 6 stories. So there's so many untold things that really leave out other people's participation, particularly women and people of color. And if you consider, how late suffrage came and, other rights, and how badly people were already fighting for those things. If you consider, just the whole conversation about attempted slave revolts, even in Kentucky, the thing that for me kind of pushes back against this idea that Kentucky was a great place to be a slave was the number of free men and enslaved men who joined the Union Army to fight for against the South and fight for the freedom. The number was so large, over 10,000 people who brought their families with them to Camp Nelson in a lot of cases. That story is not being told in a large enough way in the state yet. So I hope that my comments here honors poetry and doesn't disrespect history, because I'm hanging out with historians this evening. But thank you for listening. I'll pass the mantle to the next person.
Well, boy, we're actually honored to be with someone who brings history to life in the meaningful and just beautiful ways that you do. What an honor for Daniel and I to be here with you. And it looks like Barbara Kay agrees. So I wrote a couple discussion questions for us, but we needn't be directed by me. All 3 of us are professors, and so we're used to a lot of Q&A. So if there's a burning question in your heart and soul, you go ahead and put that in the chat room or turn off your mic and unmute yourself, and we'd be happy to talk with you. One of the questions that I wrote last night when I was thinking about our presentation today and reading about the thoughts of Daniel and Frank as we move into today is just kind of a discussion about what you think, what comparisons you can make between the inequalities that have been shared with you today that existed in revolutionary and early national United States and today. In other words, what major challenges did African Americans and women, more generally speaking, face that they also face today? How much have we changed? What do you see as continuing? And again, if you don't want to share your thoughts on that particular question, we're also happy to entertain other questions. So I'll unmute myself for a second to see if anyone has the courage to talk and speak up or post something in the chat room.
Yeah, Kelly, if I can just share something that just happened last week here at the Army War College, to give you just one thing that connects all the way back to the Revolutionary War. We were discussing diversity in the officer ranks of the U.S. Army. In my seminar, they're organizing the education here at the War College in these small group seminars, group of 15 students. We have only one Black officer, one Black colonel, coming from a distinguished family. His brother is actually a general. So in that sense, but we were discussing that, and he made very clear that Black officers to this day are predominantly pushed, pulled, relegated, you pick your verb, into support functions, supply, intelligence, those kinds of things. And the combat arms, the infantry, armored, the artillery, the special forces, they're dominated by white officers. So directly to the Revolutionary War, again, I see, of course, I see Black soldiers on the British side, on the American side. But when I look then, they're relegated to these support functions. When I look at the Civil War that Frank just mentioned, and I see these Black soldiers join the Union Army, I see them again, of course, in some of those famous units, and they've proven their worth in combat. But I also see that tens of thousands are pushed into who is digging the trenches, who is carrying the water, who is carrying the loads, and the ammunition. And so those kinds of through lines, if you will, we're still struggling with today.
One of the issues that Diane put in the chat room is the issue of redlining, right? Which emerged in the South, in order to continue segregation practices, financial inequality, housing inequalities. I wonder if anyone would like to make a few comments about that.
Well, I'll say a few things. And I think it's important to have a conversation about redlining and segregation and education, particularly institutions, at the same time. Because if you get a sense of how school systems develop, what happened in schools when it became mandatory to integrate schools, what the pushback was, a response from a community who refused to even follow the law, but were never criminalized for it. And how it still continues. I'll share a personal anecdote. In the mid-90s, I spent 3 years working in the school system in Lower Alabama. And I was in a county called Marengo County. This is 95, 96, 97. So this is not ancient history. I was assigned to all the public schools in the county. All the white students attended one school, no matter where they lived in the county. The other 3 schools were 100% Black student-wise. Now and I asked the question after visiting all the schools, did integration happen here? And their response, their legal response to integration was, they sent a few teachers to the Black schools, so the history teachers and the counselors and the librarians were in the Black schools, but the students were still segregated, but they called it a response to this legal mandate to integrate. And they did test all the Black students in the county and initially put the top 10% in the quote unquote white school. But those kids didn't stay for, you can imagine all the reasons they would not want to stay. And just the idea, I lived in a community in Linden that was integrated, at least the town, but not the streets or the neighborhoods. It was very segregated. But imagine living across the street from a school, but you had to get on a bus and ride 40 minutes across town, across the county to go to school every morning instead of just walking. Because even today, adults haven't figured this out, that this idea of racial separation, this idea of white supremacy is still so entrenched in places that are isolated away from large, metropolitan areas, that it's in those small rural spaces that I think racism still has strong feet. And I think that's also one of the reasons why most rural spaces vote conservative or are red states, and vote in the direction they voted in the past. I won't even talk about presidents right now. But I just had to share that because when I think of redlining, I can't separate it from all those things. And the current conversation to sell this idea of giving public funding to private schools, or in Kentucky, allowing tax deductions if you donate to a fund that pays for private education, which is just craziness. But it does the same thing, achieves the same thing, even in Kentucky, that allows people to have an advantage to stay entrenched in this space that doesn't allow kids to be in the same space and learn things that would contradict what they've been taught. And I'll say there's one last thing, is that the newest movement, that is a new civil rights movement that was at least televised around the world last summer, that shows how young and integrated and diverse this new movement is, I think is a result of young people having more education than their grandparents and parents. And with that information, they're making different choices and are not, the whole idea of heritage, not hate, it's more than a slogan. It's like, well, I have a book that says this is what happened, so this is obviously the right thing to do, so I'm doing this. And so you see that in the streets. I don't think enough conversations happen about why it was such an integrated movement, and still is. So I'll stop there because I can ramble all night. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody focusing on military history in 18th century, mostly, I don't have an expertise, of course, on 20th century history as much as my colleagues, but there's again some of those connections I think that are worth keeping in mind. As Kelly, you already pointed out, and I can point it out as well, when I'm thinking about these lands out in the West, or when you're discussing Massachusetts, already in that revolutionary era, you might have had that moment where seemingly things are in flux, where seemingly there is an opening. But what happens very quickly is that this opening is being closed for Blacks. That you have restrictions where they can and cannot live, areas where they can and cannot go. And that begins in that revolutionary era. That begins with these, land grants and these military bounties. That begins with Massachusetts and cities that are trying to force Blacks in certain areas and out of other areas. And then, of course, we see it then again in the 19th and especially then the 20th century with redlining. When you look at the map of Louisville, and I'm sure that some of our listeners and viewers have done that, this is with us. So these 1920s maps, they're still there. When you look at, what are the whitest parts of Louisville in the 1920s, and you look at the 1990s or the 2020s, it's the same. So this kind of segregation that didn't go away over the course of the 20th century or the beginning of the 21st century. Or when then Frank points out about the school system, To this day, when you think about public schools in Jefferson County across the river, I know you guys are in Indiana, but across the river in Jefferson County, the buzzing, to my knowledge, at least, and somebody might correct me here, happens not that white kids are buzzed into Black neighborhoods, but the other way around. So it is the Black kids that are actually then struggling with those long bus rides. They cannot go into some other schools that are taking an hour and a half to get to a school. It is not the other way around. And so things like that, again, that is those kinds of connections when you're focusing on Blacks. I think we can draw those kinds of lines from the late 18th century all the way to the 20th and 21st century.
I definitely agree. I think, and the kind of not just segregation, but the violent enforcement of the maintaining of segregation. We know about Fort Wagner and the 54th Regiment from Massachusetts because of the movie and the books from the Civil War. But where's the movie about Fort Pillow in Tennessee? Where when the Confederate soldiers arrive and take over the fort, they're so angry that most of the, even officers, but most of the soldiers are all Black, that instead of accepting their surrender, they slaughter them. After they've put down their arms, they massacre them all, except some white soldiers. But those are the kind of stories that don't get told over kind of the myth making that happens around the 54th Regiment. And you see white male humanity, but you don't see the inhumanity that the other story tells. And I think whoever makes those choices is also serving white supremacy, because there doesn't seem to be a hesitation to portray Black male inhumanity. That's what the news seems to be about. That's what the police seems to be enforcing. And they exist because the fear is raised up around that. It shows up during election cycles, this idea to be afraid of Black males. So fear has been so useful in maintaining, it's a different kind of redlining. Just decide if it doesn't work with not crossing railroad tracks, put enough fear there so that people won't even go there because they're afraid. But that fear doesn't go away. It's like, I think what we're experiencing in today's climate is kind of residue from having used fear all those years to misrepresent a whole group of people in ways that serve ultimately somebody's purse. I think it comes down to that. Somebody's trying to make a profit, not do the right thing, but make a profit. That's more important.
It's interesting to hear both of you talk. The early civil rights movement struggled so much with de jure versus de facto segregation. That is, attacking the laws that set aside individuals as lesser, right? Or treated them differently. And our modern civil rights movement is so much harder because it's attacking notions of what personhood means, I think, as both Daniel and Frank are pointing towards. It's so hard to undermine ideas and influences. One of the things that I talked about earlier is mass incarceration, the links between the founding era and today. These were targeted measures. And the way that we undermine, I think, the de facto racism that structures our criminal justice system is so much founded in individual beliefs. It's so difficult to challenge. One of the other things that I'm thinking of in listening to both Daniel and Frank is, again, this idea of access to wealth. And we see these inequalities in higher education. We know that African-American college students and poor white college college students have a more difficult time attaining college degrees because they don't have the finances from families to help fund their education. And so what we're doing in the higher education system is replicating inequality, right? Opening education to the few with the means. And I think all of this kind of comes together. We saw all of these inequalities kind of established in early America, and we've attacked it again and again. But attacking this de facto aspect of our structural inequality is so difficult. It's so challenging.
Yeah, and let me, I wholeheartedly agree, Kelly. I think you made some fantastic points there. Let me add also to something that Frank earlier mentioned. One of the things that we see already with the War of Independence is how much violence also, and often against Black Americans, was written out of the history of that conflict. Violence per se. This conflict, and military historians only over the last, and this is one of the most recent research trends, really the last 5-6 years, that more and more books come out that focus on how violent that conflict was. And instead, what has dominated for decades, for centuries, was this story of a seemingly genteel kind of revolution. That was a revolution of ideas that ushered forth the Constitution, which then ushered in this great nation. When in reality, all of these ideas, all of these things could not have been possible without the violence of a conflict that led to a civil war. And this is the first real true civil war in American history. And if you were an African American or a Black American who had joined the British or a loyalist unit, and revolutionary troops caught you or encountered your unit, you were facing some of the harshest violence. Hanging trees were common in that war. Killings of prisoners, what Frank also just mentioned with the Civil War, we talk about that with the Civil War, this, surrendering troops that were massacred, happens repeatedly in the War of Independence. The violence was so beyond what was acceptable for 18th century warfare that actually, and this is the argument that historians make today, that this so violent, so brutal war of vengeance that was waged had to be literally whitewashed, had to be cleaned, had to be written differently. And immediately at the end of the War of Independence in 1783, essentially then a historiography takes hold that talks about the coming of the revolution, and then constitutions and debates in Congress, and the founding of the United States, but leaves everything else out. And that continued. I'm sure that, I do not know what Kelly's experience was, that continued even in my own graduate school experience, when everything was discussed with the American Revolution, but the war. Because that war was so dirty, was so brutal and so violent that it could not and did not fit into the narrative that the American Revolution was supposed to be.
Could I break it? Because actually what you guys are saying is exactly what I've seen I'm a senior citizen now, and I'm not from this area, but I tell you what, when I moved here and I started getting to know people, what you're saying back in the Civil Revolution is actually even happening now, but we don't know about it. I mean, I considered myself not even middle income. Actually, I feel my dad did great for having 7 kids. We always had clothes and a roof over our head and shoes on our feet and food on the table. But I have met people that are younger than me that had to fight and forage the forest for their dinner. They did not have indoor plumbing, and these people are still alive today. So what you're talking about is happening now. And what you don't see is because everything is so washed away and cleaned and rinsed so that only the dramatic things are being said or heard and not otherwise. My kids, I sent my boys on a bus for an hour and a half one way in Los Angeles. Because number one, I wanted them to go to a smaller school. It just happened to be far enough downtown LA that they rode a bus. It was a perfect babysitter for me. But they also got to experience things that they never got to experience, you know, if they had gone to the local school. So and I do genealogy, and I've been doing it for over 20 years. And this is really educating because now I understand some of the paperwork that I run across. But I guess my point is you don't see things because people are not willing to look beyond their bubble.
It's true. It takes a lot of empathy and compassion to be a historian or just be an individual in this modern world and think beyond the divisive rhetoric and think about what is it like to be a human being? How can we do better? Let's look at our social structures. And I appreciate you being here tonight and sharing your experiences. It looks like we're about at the end of our time. So I want to pass it back over to Diane, who hosted us, Frank, Daniel, and I this evening. And I'd like to, of course, share my appreciation to my co-presenters. It was such a treat to be with you this evening. I hope we get to share some spaces again in the future.
I'd just like to thank everybody for coming and let you know that I put some links for a few library programs and other items of interest in the chat. And if you are interested in opening any of those, you might want to do that now or download the chat before it all disappears. And I really appreciate all of our speakers here tonight, putting their hard work into this. Everybody, this was wonderful. And I hope to see you all again soon, maybe in real life someday again. So
yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kelly, for and Diane for organizing, and thank you, Frank, for sharing some of your poems. It was truly a pleasure, and thank you to the audience for joining and making it possible. Yes, and Diane, I think you're right. We will all be looking forward to seeing each other, not just as little squares here on some online platform. So that and you know, shake hands and actually enjoy the humanity that we all have. So thank you.
Agree. Ditto everything everybody else said. I just can't wait to hug again. See you guys in person after COVID. Take care.